Thank you. I wish I could be there in person, but unfortunately it needs to be remote this year. But thank you so much for joining us. We have a lively discussion about doing a deep dive into DBS, and DBS has obviously been a hot topic here for the last year. So let's kind of take a peek of where we are today, and then we can go to our panelists and talk about some of the new indications and new emerging therapies that we're seeing within the DBS space. So just a little bit about what they've seen in the neurotech business reports headlines that have been happening. So we're so happy to have Erica Ross here because Abbott obviously made some headline news about DBS and going into depression and getting their breakthrough status. But it's really interesting that we've also seen some other indications. So traditionally, DBS has been in the movement disorder space, but now we're starting to see some emergence into areas like psychiatric disorders, depression, an expansion of dystonia, as well as even addiction. So there's a lot of things that we're learning about the brain and where DBS might be able to be applied. So that's, of course, something that we want to talk about today. Also, what we've seen over a period of time is the change of players or the entrance of players, if you will, not just in DBS, but more so in brain interfaces. And the way that I kind of want to frame brain interfaces in this discussion is not including BCI, but really looking at brain interfaces as a therapy within the brain rather than a communication tool or a means to be able to control an outside device. So the big three, now Abbott, are in the DBS space, but we're also seeing players coming in the movement disorders area for DBS, some new players. So we're lucky to have Luther here from Neuronica, but there's some other players in terms of Allevia and bioinduction, which is another new company that's looking at new applications of DBS. But I think another interesting thing that might drive some of our conversation today is looking at that third column is the companies that have been entering DBS, but for different types of applications. So for instance, UCSF is doing a study using the NeuroPace RNS device, particularly for depression. Also, the two companies of Inspire and Juno have entered into the space of brain stimulation or implanted brain stimulation for stroke recovery, which Jim alluded to earlier. That many years ago, North Star Neurosciences was in that space. Also, we have Nia Therapeutics that's looking at memory, and of course, functional neuromod, which Jim introduced in the earlier today, about what they're doing in terms of Alzheimer's. And of course, we're lucky here also to have today Jacob Robinson that's going to be introducing us to Motif Neurotech. So I partially introduced some of our panelists, but we'll go ahead and do that again, and then we'll let them do introductions. So Luther Krinkle is the CEO of Neuronica. Great to have you here. Erica Ross is the Director of Clinical and Applied Research at Abbott. Great to have us join us virtually, Erica, as well as Jacob Robinson, who is the co-founder and CEO of Motif Neurotech. So let's do a couple of introductions, and then we can get into some discussion questions. So Luther, if you could start us off with some introductions about yourself and Neuronica.
Okay, you should be good to go. And then I have to share my screen so that the Zoom world can see it as well.
Okay, maybe we can just stand behind you so I see the slides.
Well, I'm going to leave you. Give me one second here. And let me share that. Let's see if that works. You all seeing it?
We can.
Oh, we got to do the old, we know how to do that now. I thought I did. The one at the bottom. How about that? Is that working?
It looks good.
All right.
Online.
You're good to go. Just use the arrow keys.
And I have what, 3 minutes?
Three to five.
3 to 5.
Oh, good. Okay. Great. So I'm Lothar. I'm the CEO of Neuronica. In short, we're raising a Series B to bring to market what I would argue is the world's most advanced deep brain stimulation system. So a lot was talked already about DBS, but just, oops, how do I make this move? Press here. Use the earpiece. All right. Ah, perfectly. Okay. So we talk a lot about the market size and all that, but then at the end of the day, we need to, remind ourselves that 800 billion is the socioeconomic cost of neurodegenerative diseases, and that does not include depression. Okay, so that's really the problem we need to solve. And we're going to get back to really also some other topics that are close to my heart. Hopefully, I will be asked about them. So DBS is a $1 billion market today, but it does involve a brain implant, and most commercial DBS systems at this point are open loop. That means they stimulate the same amount of electricity by minute, by hour, every day. And so we basically said, what do we need to do to address some of the key barriers of adoption? Symptoms still fluctuate even after DBS. I just looked up the Boston Scientific, which arguably was the best study ever in DBS because it was placebo controlled, but the patients only increased their on time by about 3 hours. So symptoms still fluctuate in patients with DBS. Patients get simulation-induced side effects. DBS systems are complicated to program. It's time consuming and carries risks, of course. So what if we could address these issues? So the way we are addressing these are with closed loop deep brain stimulation. Design criteria for us were these: no change to the surgical procedure. I think we're going to get a question later on the surgical procedures, but neurosurgeons don't really like to change their procedure unless there's a big argument. So nothing changes about the procedure. All the magic is in the IPG. The IPG measures brain activities through the existing leads, similar leads that are implanted today, interprets these signals, and then automatically adjusts stimulation parameters so that the patient gets the right amount of electricity minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. I hope this video works. So a video shows much more than data at some point, right? So this is a patient here. On the left, you see this patient has conventional deep brain stimulation and is on peak dose. So patients still get medication. And you see in this patient that a side effect appears, which is called dyskinesia. On the right, you see the same patient on the same amount of medication, but with adaptive DBS. And the patient looks much more normal because the system automatically adjusted to the amount of electricity that that patient needed at that point. So that's a video, but what about real clinical data? So this is just one patient. We're still in our feasibility trial, so I can't show you those data, but here's one example patient. So this patient on conventional deep brain stimulation would have about 6.5 hours of good on time. And when I was Medtronic, when I ran that business, for that DBS business, I said, success, 6.5 hours of great on time for the patient. Well, except that that patient also spent almost 3 hours in off and 7.2 hours in on, but with dyskinesia. On adaptive DBS with our system, the patient spent 16 hours the entire day in the perfect state on without dyskinesia. And you might say, what's the rest of the day? The patient actually slept, right? And so in fact, we also saw in this, but in some of these patients that their sleep improves because they get better treatment. Oops, wrong direction. So I hope I convinced you that adaptive DBS can have a true clinical impact here by reducing the fluctuations throughout the day, by reducing stimulation-induced side effects, and to use automaticity to enable faster programming of these systems. Sorry. And of course, DBS, and that was mentioned earlier, is a platform technology that can be used for many other indications. I think we're going to get into this later today. So we're raising a Series B. If there's any investors that want to invest, that'd be great. that will enable us to conduct our pivotal trial.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lothar. Next, I'd like to have Erica Ross introduce herself and what Abbott is doing recently in terms of DBS. So, Erica.
Thanks, Jen. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, everyone. It's great to see the turnout today, and looking forward to next year and being able to see everyone and network in person. But I'm Erica Ross. I'm the Director of Clinical and Applied Research at Abbott Neuromodulation. We have a variety of stimulation systems to treat movement disorders and chronic pain syndromes on market today. I am representing the work that we are doing now in depression. So earlier this year, we received breakthrough designation from the FDA to move forward again in our work with depression, DBS to treat treatment-resistant depression. So we're really excited to work with the investigators we've been working with and the patients who are suffering from treatment-resistant depression to really make sure we're designing this study to show how successful this therapy can really be for this population of people. I'll look forward to an exciting panel discussion after Jacob introduces Motif.
Great, thank you, Erica. Jacob, please give us an introduction of Motif Neurotech for us.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
You should be able to share your screen.
Okay, great.
Oh, great.
Do that through Zoom.
Okay, great. And you guys can see it on Zoom, okay. All right, first of all, thanks a bunch for the opportunity to join you guys for this panel. It's my first time here, so I appreciate the time to introduce what it is that we're doing. My name's Jacob Robinson. I'm a professor at Rice, and I'm on a professional leave to start a company called Motif that spun out a technology that we've been developing under the lab, in large part to the Brain Initiative. So thanks, Nick. So I'm a little bit of an imposter in the DBS panel. My apologies. So we're actually looking at tiny devices that might be a minimally invasive approach to provide similar types of therapy that one can get with DBS. Our idea is, can we make neurotechnology as small and minimally invasive as possible? I was fortunate to be able to work with some clinical co-founders. So my background's in physics and materials. So I think about, how do we communicate with devices inside the body? And I've been able to work with Samir Sheth, who's an expert in functional neurosurgery, particularly for psychiatric conditions, a neurologist, Sunil Sheth, and another electrical engineer, Kaiwan. And that's kind of the core team that came together to try to think about how we can build these minimally invasive neurodevices, as I will mention, for applications outside of traditional DBS toward psychiatric conditions. And the impetus, I don't have to convince you guys of this, but the way that we think about the problem is that mental health conditions are network level problems. And I emphasize network here because I think, we need to think beyond individual brain areas and perhaps several distributed brain areas when we think about next generation therapeutics. And we do know, I think all of us agree that particularly for these network level disorders, drugs often fail, and it's a neuromodulation that is an approach that can succeed perhaps where pharmaceuticals struggle. And so when we've been thinking about what we could do, if we could miniaturize neurotechnology, make it less invasive, we could look at where DBS is today in the case of treating Parkinson's disease. And the fact that it was brought up a little bit earlier is that it's a very narrow sliver of that market that we're able to capture. And it's for a couple of reasons, right? One, many patients don't qualify for that procedure. And then number two, there's a real and perceived risk associated with devices that go deep into the brain. I'm actually really thrilled about the work that's going on at Abbott, where there's opportunities to take on, I think, really important and unaddressed markets like treatment-resistant depression with deep brain stimulation. And so these technologies are coming to market. And the hope that we have is that we can expand that market, make these potentially life-saving, in the case of TRD, these life-saving therapies accessible to more people by making the procedure less invasive, simpler to perform and easily removed, so that DBS isn't thought of as like a treatment of last resort, but rather higher up in that treatment ladder, perhaps in addition to pharmaceuticals. So the approach that we have is based on a miniaturization of devices. I have a prototype here. It's about the size of a pea. These are functional. And they get implanted in the skull above the dura here, so that there is no contact with the neural tissue. This allows us to make the procedure fast, outpatient. It's about 20 minutes. It's also reversible. So a 20-minute procedure can remove the device as well. And it's a hybrid. We heard a little bit about hybrid devices where we have implants and wearables. Our device pairs with a headset that sends data to the implant, tells it how to stimulate it. It also delivers all of its power. So these devices that we implant have no batteries in them. That's how we can make them so small. Additionally, we can pull neural data back to enable future closed loop therapies, although as was mentioned, initial indications might not even need that, but it's a platform technology upon which we can build these types of network interfaces. Now, the reason why we can do this is because of that power delivery issue. Typically, when you make devices really small, it's hard to deliver energy to them, right? I'm a physicist, so we're going to do 2 seconds on a wireless power delivery. So magnetic induction is how we typically power these devices inside the body. I take a magnetic field produced by a coil. I capture that with another coil. That's how your iPhone charges on its power mat. The problem is that the amount of energy I get depends on the area of that pickup coil. So these small devices are very poorly powered when we miniaturize them. In fact, if I look at a device that's about 6 millimeters squared, there's about half a milliwatt. We're capturing 10 times that amount of energy because of the physics of the materials that we use to capture that magnetic field. We use a electric material that vibrates, and that vibrational energy gets converted into electrical energy. Similar physics as ultrasound powered devices. Companies like IOTA rely on this, but the advantage that we have is that we're driving this with a magnetic field, not an ultrasound wave. As a result, we're able to move this device, tip it, turn it, translate it, and still couple efficiently to our device. And that's really the key, I think, that distinguishes what we're doing compared to what people are doing with midfield or ultrasound. And so then the question is, can we target areas of the cortex to achieve similar efficacy as we see for deep brain stimulation in the case of Parkinson's disease? And indeed, motor cortex stimulation delivers good results for recovery of motor movement in the case of Parkinson's disease. And I think most impressively, in the case of treatment-resistant depression, we've seen work out of the Saint trials and now Magnus Medical, where cortical stimulation can deliver really dramatic results in terms of treatment-resistant depression. However, the major drawback here is that it requires basically 5 days in the clinic, and you can see the efficacy start to wane over the course of a few weeks. So the idea being that we can now create these types of cortical, highly effective therapeutic options that can be delivered in the comfort of your own home following a single outpatient procedure. So anyway, I want to kind of also mention a couple of other important differentiators. The fact that this is a burr hole procedure, it's a standard surgical procedure. There's no disruption of the dura. We think that we can train neurosurgeons, general neurosurgeons, and perhaps move to the ambulatory surgical centers to really help with distribution, which is potentially a challenge for more invasive neurosurgeries. And the last thought that I like to kind of leave you with is sometimes I like to think about the story of kind of where electronic medicine came from. And you guys probably know this more than I do, but you can look at the roots back in early days of Medtronic where they created pacemakers that were battery powered. Right, we have IPG, we have leads, and this is the foundation for electronic medicine. What I think was really interesting about this story, though, is in 1960, when this came out, the analysis of the market size was that there would only ever be 10,000 people globally that would use a pacemaker. But sure enough, today there's over 1 million of these sold. The nature of creating this battery power device that could be implanted allowed us to go beyond cardiac pacing, which is life-saving, and go to spinal cord stimulation, DBS, et cetera. So I like to imagine that with the ability to have wireless power and distributed sensing and stimulation, we might look at markets that don't even exist today because the types of devices that are available using traditional technologies really can't address those types of markets. So I think this idea of distributed network interfaces is potentially a future for electronic medicine, but that's very self-serving. So thank you all for your attention and the opportunity to be here.
Great, thanks,
So
Jacob.
because Earl told me this, Earl Buck and so also Medtronic, right? It wasn't just the battery power. It was also the transistor. It was the first device that actually featured the transistor. So the combination of batteries and transistors actually allowed that innovation under your nose, because you know, anyone could have come up with it. You just had to put it together.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Luthar. So we're going to move into the discussion phase of this session. And if anyone in the audience virtually has a question, please put it in the chat. And we have people on site, including Jim and Jeremy, who will keep an eye out for any questions in the audience. So to kind of kick off our discussion, let me start with you, Erica, and then maybe we'll go to Jacob on this question. Is, you know, DBS has traditionally been known for movement disorders, right? And that's a fairly straightforward target. But now we're looking at psychiatric conditions where the measurement scales are not as straightforward as you would typically find with movement disorders. So how do you envision the neurotechnology space addressing this issue where measurement scales aren't as straightforward?
That's a great question, Jen. So I think the great thing, the beauty of approaching a movement disorder with something like neurostimulation is you have a very clear indication of target engagement. We have an understanding of how you're affecting that symptom that you're trying to target with stimulation. And we have the luxury in this space of really having high time resolution of when we're delivering a therapy and understanding how we can really engage a circuit. So we have this luxurious world we've been spending time in movement disorders, which isn't simple, but it's a lot simpler than a neuropsychiatric disorder. We're moving to this area where we've had a variety of failed trials across different large medical device companies, including our own. St. Jude Medical had a pretty large study that was discontinued because of a futility analysis. What we did not realize is what target engagement actually looks like in this patient population and how to really measure it over time and how to design a study so that you can really understand the effect that you're having in this patient population. It's completely different from trying to do it in a population of folks with Parkinson's disease or essential tremor. And that's where we're really focused. It's how do we, one, find the right folks. So how do we select really clearly for who will respond to this therapy? How do we make sure we start with a population of folks who really have a perturbable system? One of our key advisors continues to hone in on. Make sure you have a brain that will respond to therapy still. We really need to make sure we have that to begin with. Make sure we have a way to ensure that you're targeting the right place. Something that we learned very clearly from Broaden. If you're not in the right place and you're trying to stimulate an intersection of networks that are highly involved and critical to engage for perturbing that system, then you're shooting behind the skeet if you're trying to add an exogenous stimulation to the wrong part of the brain. So making sure that we're in the right part of the brain with these therapies is critical, and ensuring we're using technology that we have available today and in order to do that well. And finally, making sure that we have the right outcome measures, making sure that this study is designed for success. And over time, with the tools that we've developed at Abbott around the digital ecosystem, we have a lot that we've built into our own systems with Virtual Clinic, with our whole Neurosphere platform, where we have these ways to digitally engage with people. And in this population, it's really critical to be able to do that. Make sure you have hands-on throughout the course of a therapy. I think we're really set up for success now and have been able to learn from the history of this field and generally, and more specifically what was done at St. Jude.
Great, thank you. Jacob, if you could weigh in on that topic as well, because in your presentation, you mentioned both Parkinson's disease and treatment-resistant depression, trying to find that right target population within treatment-resistant depression. And what do you think are some of the hurdles to get over and how we might address that?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So we look at these two populations, I think, because there is a perception that there is a risk associated with going into mental health for neurodevices. And I think it's coming primarily historically, as Erica mentioned, with some of the failures previously with Broaden. But I think if you talk to the experts in the field, I think we're at a very different place than we were 10 years ago. One, the trial design is so much better. I think a lot of the failures earlier were related to not being able to measure target engagement, which I think we're not going to repeat. And so if you look at some of those post hocs, there are very clear responders from that group. And the problem was that there are also many non-responders. And I think if we can do a better job of segmenting the analysis, particularly by measuring that target engagement, as well as using functional measures to cite the electrodes in the first place, which was one of the other earlier failures, I think we're set up to have tremendous success in this space. That being said, that adoption it's unclear when that adoption is going to happen. So what we're looking at is, as we come to market, hopefully create less invasive alternatives, that we can also address some of the indications that are currently being treated by DBS, because there's a little bit of a risk associated with how long that TRD market is going to take to develop.
Great, thanks, Jim. And so Luther, you had mentioned, you introduced us to your adaptive DBS systems. When you start to think beyond Parkinson's disease or movement disorders, how are you thinking about closed loop systems for some indications that might not have such a clear target?
Yeah, does this work? Okay, I take this one. So thanks for the question. This is an important one that's close to my heart. Anyone who does DBS for depression, I would argue, should really look at biomarkers. And in the past, that was difficult. I was at Medtronic, and we used Aspect Medical technology in our very small depression trial, and we didn't find anything. But the technology has moved on. So I would encourage everyone to look at a company out here called Alto Neuroscience. They just closed a big round again, and they are really focused on using complex biomarkers, EEG-based ones, to stratify patients. And the advantage that we have in our field here is that we actually send a signal to the brain and we get an echo. What Alto is trying to do is actually predict who's going to be responded to a drug versus not, right? That's really hard. But by giving actually some kind of therapy and see if that moves the brain into the right direction, that's the right argument. Okay, so I feel strongly that eventually we will have closed loop deep brain stimulation also for depression. Now, we don't have the biomarkers quite yet. There is some data there. So the area that I'm particularly interested in, it's not a big market, to be honest, although for a small company, it might be okay. Tourette. So in Tourette, just like in epilepsy, you can actually get a biomarker just before the tic occurs. So this is, which is the reason why really down in Florida, they use the NeuroPace device in Tourette. So I think, but Tourette has of course, there's an angle. Most patients with Tourette have OCD, and then their OCD and depression are related. So I feel strongly that we're going to find it, but we're not ready yet. To me, the important part is that anyone who does a trial in DBS or any trial in deep brain stimulation, that they really should be thinking about EEG and other biomarkers to measure, because that's the only way you get incredibly clean clinical data versus trying to just extract it from day-to-day real-world evidence. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Hey,
Yeah,
Lothar, if
that-
you don't mind sorry, Jen, if you don't mind just interjecting, because you mentioned Aspect Medical, and I just wanted
Yeah.
to mention just recently, Medtronic, which picked up Aspect Medical by virtue of Covidien. Covidien bought Aspect back in, I don't know, 15 years ago. And then it went over to Medtronic. So Medtronic just a couple of days ago announced that they were spinning that division off. So that's going to be a separate, not just the BIS product, but a number of other products with it. So that's going to get spun off. It's like $2 billion business. So it may be that the whole biomarker thing will be, a new company. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. You're an ex-Medtronic person. Do you have any insight on that deal?
I wish I do, but I've left Medtronic almost 6 years ago. I don't think Medtronic views Aspect Medical, I would assume, as a biomarker company, but really as a depth of anesthesia monitoring business that, doesn't quite fit, I assume.
But I
have
mentioned that
no
because
insight.
Aspect had a separate product line
Yeah.
besides BIS. In fact, they had a deal with Boston Scientific that kind of fell through, where they were using that for biomarkers to detect which psychiatric interventions would be most effective. Where that went, unfortunately, it never became the big business that everyone hoped it would be, but maybe this NewCo will, as yet unnamed company will be able to take the ball.
And I do know that UCLA is
Dr.
actually
Luchter.
working with that.
Yeah.
Dr. Luchter.
Sorry, Jen.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. So let's stick with you. We've seen in the neurotech space and neurotech ecosystem that, we've seen this wave of minimally invasive devices. A part of what Jacob had presented today is trying to move from less invasive devices, from invasive devices. And even Dr. John mentioned this morning that the patient really needs to be driven to a surgery. So what are your thoughts in terms of the vulnerabilities of traditional DBS in this space as we're starting to see some of the changes in the marketplace?
So that was to me, yeah?
Yes. Mhm.
That was to me, yeah, okay. Look, I've been at Medtronic for many years, and obviously I talk to my friends at Abbott and Boston. So I really don't like to throw big companies under the bus. Where's their vulnerability is, because I'm sure they have lots of people that look at how to scan the horizon. They have, we do have Erica here, but I think part of the vulnerability is really that if you are a big company, you're locked into the products you already have. You have to think about reverse compatibility. For you really to move then to the next set of technologies is difficult, because now you kind of need to move on to something completely different. And Medtronic, it took a long time to convince management, I think, that Micra was a good idea. Micra is basically a catheter delivered, very, very tiny pacemaker that doesn't have all the fancy things that the traditional cardiac pacemaker would have. So I think the vulnerabilities are in that it may, at a big company, there's always an engineer that's going to say, we tried that, it doesn't work. So which is why I think you guys are going to be successful. This minimally invasive stuff is really hard for the big device companies to move fast on, because it requires such completely different technology that their infrastructure doesn't support. That's what I would think. Obviously, we placed our bet that Medtronic has invested heavily in closed loop DBS, which, by the way, that was me with of course Tim Dennison and those guys. And so they're creating the need, and the others don't have closed loop, and so hopefully we have a good exit strategy, because the other companies have maybe invested less in that kind of technology. But I think it's usually, if someone really comes up with completely different technology, it's really hard for a big company to jump on.
Yeah, Erica, can you respond to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Lothar. I think Jacob and I have had this conversation in the past as well. He's like, when is the right time to get an Abbott or somebody like you involved? It's like, definitely not yet. You have to get to a point where you've shown that this is going to change the market. And I'm with Lothar. I think the minimally invasive options are the future for this field. And I think that in order to maintain the field, we need the traditional devices that continue to provide these life-saving and life-changing therapies to patients. So everybody plays a role in how we continue to maintain and carve out new spaces in these different markets.
Interesting. Yeah. Jacob, you're in the pioneering of the minimally invasive devices when it comes to brain interfaces. Can you talk a little bit about the arguments that you would make in terms of the vulnerability of traditional DBS against what you're offering?
The vulnerability of traditional DB. So it's interesting. I think what we imagine is the opportunities for minimally invasive is that it opens up new therapeutic options. It's not necessarily a DBS replacement, although I think there will be some people who would convert to a minimally invasive solution, but I think it's going to be more arrows in the quiver, so to speak, particularly with the idea of being able to scale to multiple distributed sites for stimulation and recording. I think one thing that came up earlier is this idea of biomarkers and target engagement. Oftentimes the measurement of the biomarkers might be at a different location than stimulation. And so being able to create architectures that are not the traditional DBS architectures is where I think there's going to be advantages to kind of grow that space of electronic medicine. And so I see these as complementary technologies.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll stick with you for a second. That there was a question in the chat. I know you addressed it, but if you can address it just real quickly in terms so that everyone in the room can get your perspective on this, is really looking at how your technology is different from traditional ultrasound technology.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So sometimes as this comes up, there's first of all, I don't want to claim we're the only people doing minimally invasive. We're the best people doing minimally invasive. That's a clear distinction I want you guys to know. The other methods for delivering power. So delivering power wirelessly is really critical for minimally invasive. The micro was brought up. The micro uses a tiny battery. Tiny batteries just don't support a lot of energy for an extended period of time. So you can do like pacing, but doing DBS would never work because of the amount of current that it draws on average. So you need wireless power, number one. So then the question is, how do I do it? I can use ultrasound. I talked about magnetic induction. Magnetic induction is going to be very challenging with anything small. Or midfield is brought up in the case of Nuspera. And then what we have is magnetoelectric. So I'll do a quick like differentiator between those three. So for ultrasound, the advantages are deep penetration. The disadvantages are getting through bone, right? Ultrasound reflects off of bone. The other disadvantage is getting through air. So I would need to have in gel or jelly or something like that with my transducer. So we look at applications where if I need to go through bone, if I need to have like a non-contact transmitter, that's where I think we have major advantages. The other advantage is that ultrasound and midfield both used a focused beam. So that's great if you're well aligned to your target or if you have a single target. But if my transmitter moves, or if I have multiple devices that I'm trying to power at the same time, you really need some kind of energy that gets distributed broadly. In the case of magnetoelectrics, that magnetic field goes everywhere. So I know there's a lot to unpack there, but I think if you think about where magnetoelectrics has a special place, that's in good misalignment tolerance, going through air, going through bone.
Great, thank you. So Jim, are there any questions in the room for the panel?
Okay, we have one question in the room. Is there anyone on Zoom who has a question?
Nope, we've
Okay, well, let's
addressed
go
those.
ahead and pass the.
Thank you. A question for the panel, but this might be more for Erica. As we look at some disease states, let's take epilepsy, for example. There's an enormous population that is drug treatment resistant. Problem is it takes oftentimes 8 to 10 years for them to get to the point where they get a VNS therapy or a DBS or some alternative. So when we think about depression and the pathway, let's assume that the DBS is a successful alternative. How do you see that impacting that pathway so that a patient doesn't go wandering through the darkness for 10 to 15 years before something happens?
That's a great question. I think in the neuromodulation field in general, our devices become a last line therapy instead of earlier in the continuum, which is really where they belong. The data keeps showing the earlier you are able to get these systems for movement disorders, for chronic pain syndromes, the better off you are. And we end up with folks who have failed so many therapies by the time they get to the right people who are able to implant. So I'm thinking in terms of market penetrance and some of the questions we were just talking through with where in the continuum do you have the right tools in the bag with these reps, and where do you make sure that you're getting the right interface with the doctors so that people are really well educated about how effective neuromodulation therapies can be. That's really where we have to spend our time. Neuropsychiatric disorders is going to be a whole nother ball game. It's a completely different call point. It's a completely different patient population. I think in terms of how well organized they are, we're in good shape, similar to movement disorders. People who are participants in these kind of clinical trials are really knowledgeable about what therapy options exist today. I think we have an opportunity in the neuropsychiatric space to do something very different. So we're approaching it that way, especially as we think about how well educated people are who are looking for new therapies today, how many new ways we have to reach people compared to the last time we did a study, how well we can really understand baseline, what different phenotypes actually look like in terms of what symptom mixes folks have when they're being considered for these clinical studies and beyond. So it's a really good question. It's a really complicated issue across all of our therapy areas, all of our practice areas, but it's something I think the field is aware of and is really trying to understand as we move towards emerging therapies and emerging areas, or emerging practice areas. How do we do it slightly differently?
Great. Thank you, Erica. So we are out of time, unfortunately, but we could talk for much longer about this. But Erica, thanks so much for joining our panel. Lothar and Jacob, thank you for joining us on site as well. And I'm going to hand it back to Jim for lunch.
And Jen, thank you very much for chairing a great session.